Paris, 1848. Before the thunderous footsteps of the Bolsheviks, before the iron grip of the Stalinist era, and even before the ink was dry on the Communist Manifesto, there was a dream. It was a dream born not of steel and industry, but of morality and imagination. To understand the radical transformations of the 20th century, we must first look backward to a group of thinkers who believed that the world's problems could be solved not through class warfare, but through the sheer force of human reason and compassion. These were the utopian socialists. The term utopian was actually a label later applied, often derisively, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They used it to distinguish their own scientific approach to history from the idealistic visions of those who came before them. But to call them merely dreamers is to overlook the profound intellectual crisis they were attempting to solve. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were a time of unprecedented chaos. The Enlightenment had promised reason, and the French Revolution had promised liberty. But as the smoke cleared, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to loom on the horizon, bringing with it a new kind of misery, the squalor of the urban working class, the crushing weight of inequality, and the dehumanization of the factory system. In this era of upheaval, several key figures emerged with radical blueprints for a new society. In France, Henry de Saint-Simon proposed a vision of a society led by scientists, engineers, and industrialists. He believed that the chaotic competition of capitalism should be replaced by a planned, meritocratic system where the productive classes managed society for the benefit of the poorest. To Saint-Simon, the goal wasn't to destroy the hierarchy, but to make it efficient and purposeful. Then there was Charles Fourier, perhaps the most eccentric of the group. Fourier envisioned a world organized into small, self-sustaining communities called phalansteries. In these communal living spaces, work would not be a drudgery, but a passion. He believed that by organizing society around human desires and varied tasks, the friction of social life would vanish. He even predicted, with startling foresight, the eventual liberation of women as a metric of social progress. And we cannot forget Robert Owen, the Welsh industrialist who attempted to turn his theories into reality. At his cotton mills in New Lanark, Scotland, Owen proved that a business could be profitable without exploiting its workers. He provided education for children, shorter working hours, and decent housing. He was a man who believed that human character was formed by one's environment. If you changed the environment, you could change the human being. These thinkers shared a common thread. They believed that socialism could be achieved through peaceful persuasion. They believed that if they could simply present a perfect, harmonious model of society, the ruling classes would see its rationality and voluntarily surrender their privilege. They sought to build a paradise on earth through cooperation rather than revolution. They were architects of hope, attempting to bridge the gap between the old world of feudalism and the new world of industrial capitalism. But as the 19th century progressed, their peaceful experiments began to falter. The reality of class interest proved far more stubborn than their theories allowed. The dream of the utopians was about to collide with the reality of the struggle. And as the gears of industry turned faster, a much darker, much more aggressive theory was waiting in the wings. Manchester, 1830. If the utopian socialists were the architects of a dream, the Industrial Revolution was the waking nightmare that rendered their peaceful visions obsolete. While thinkers like Fourier and Owen were sketching blueprints for harmonious communes, The landscape of Europe was being physically and socially torn asunder by the relentless roar of the steam engine. This was the era of the Great Divergence. For centuries, the rhythm of human life had been dictated by the seasons, the sun, and the slow, predictable pace of agrarian toil. But the advent of mechanized production changed the very pulse of civilization. In the burgeoning industrial hubs of England, the countryside was being hollowed out. Small-scale farmers, unable to compete with large-scale, machine-driven agriculture, were forced off their ancestral lands. They had no choice but to migrate toward the growing, soot-stained silhouettes of the new industrial cities. They were looking for work, but what they found was a new kind of existence. This mass migration gave birth to a new social phenomenon, a new class of human being that history had never seen before: the proletariat. The word itself, derived from the Latin proletarius, originally referred to the lowest class of Roman citizens, those whose only contribution to the state was their offspring. In the 19th century, the term took on a much more visceral meaning. The proletariat were the wage laborers, men, women, and children who owned nothing except their own capacity to work. They possessed no land, no tools of production, and no capital. Their only way to survive was to sell their labor, hour by hour, to the owners of the machines. The conditions of this new class were nothing short of catastrophic. As the cities swelled to accommodate the influx of workers, infrastructure failed to keep pace. Families were crammed into damp, windowless tenements in urban slums where cholera and typhus were constant companions. The air was thick with the sulfurous stench of coal smoke, and the streets were rivers of filth. Inside the factories, the dehumanization was even more profound. The worker was no longer a craftsman who took pride in a finished product. They were merely a cog in a vast, unfeeling mechanism. The discipline of the clock replaced the rhythm of nature. Shifts lasted 16, sometimes 18 hours a day. The machines did not tire, so the humans were expected not to tire either. In the textile mills and coal mines, children as young as 6 were employed to crawl into cramped spaces, their small frames a necessity for the efficiency of the machine. This was the social question that haunted the 19th century. The gap between the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat was widening into a chasm. The wealth generated by this era was staggering, fueling the rise of global empires and unprecedented technological progress, but that wealth was being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. The utopian socialists had hoped that through reason, the owners would share this wealth. But as the proletariat lived in squalor, watching the capital they helped create grow into mountains of gold for a tiny elite, a bitter realization began to take hold. The struggle was not merely a misunderstanding of morality. It was a fundamental conflict of interest. The gears of industry were turning, but they were grinding the working class into the very dust they inhabited. And in that dust, the seeds of a much more violent transformation were beginning to germinate. London, 1844. While the soot of the Industrial Revolution settled over the working class, a different kind of storm was brewing in the libraries and coffee houses of Europe. The social question had been posed, but it lacked a definitive answer. The utopian thinkers had provided a dream, but they had not provided a mechanism for change. To turn the desperation of the masses into a political force, the world needed more than moral appeals. It needed a theory of history. It needed a scientific explanation for why the world was broken, and a roadmap for how to fix it. This is where two men, bound by intellect and an unlikely friendship, would provide the spark that would eventually set the world on fire. Karl Marx was a man of intense, almost volcanic intellectual energy. A German philosopher and journalist, Marx was a creature of deep study and even deeper frustration. He was an outsider, a radical thinker whose ideas often landed him in trouble with the censors of the various European states. He possessed a mind that refused to accept the world at face value. Where others saw the natural order of kings and capitalists, Marx saw a battlefield. He was obsessed with the why. Why did poverty persist amidst plenty? Why did power always concentrate at the top? But Marx was not a solitary force. He found his intellectual equal, and perhaps his most vital collaborator, in Friedrich Engels. If Marx was the philosopher, Engels was the witness. Born into a wealthy family of German industrialists, Engels had a perspective that Marx could only grasp through books. Engels had seen the belly of the beast firsthand. To support his family and fund his radical pursuits, he worked in his father's textile mills in Manchester. He saw the broken bodies of the workers, the cruelty of the factory owners, and the crushing weight of the industrial machine. He had lived in the very slums he would later write about. The meeting of these two minds was a collision of theory and lived reality. Engels provided the empirical data, the hard, cold facts of the working class's suffering, while Marx provided the grand, sweeping philosophical framework to interpret it. Together, they moved beyond the what-if of the utopian socialists and moved toward the how. They began to develop a concept that would change the course of human history: historical materialism. They argued that history was not driven by great ideas, by religion, or by the whims of kings, but by the material conditions of life. They posited that the very structure of society, its laws, its politics, its culture, was built upon its economic foundation. Specifically, they argued that history was a series of class struggles, a continuous, violent tension between those who own the means of production and those who do the work. For Marx and Engels, the Industrial Revolution wasn't just a period of technological change. It was the final stage of this struggle. They believed the contradictions of capitalism had become so great that the system was destined to collapse under its own weight. They weren't just predicting a change. They were announcing an inevitability. The spark had been struck. The question was no longer whether the world would change, but how much blood would be spilled when the fire finally caught. London, 1848. If the previous years had been a period of quiet, intellectual brooding, then 1848 was the year the theory found its voice. Amidst the growing tremors of revolution across the European continent, Marx and Engels produced a document that was less a polite political treatise and more a battle cry. It was titled the Communist Manifesto. It was not a book of suggestions. It was a declaration of war. The manifesto distilled their complex theories into a sharp, rhythmic, and devastatingly simple narrative. It began with a sentence that would echo through the halls of power and the trenches of revolution for the next century and a half. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. With this, they framed communism not as a fringe movement, but as an inescapable reality that the ruling classes were already desperately trying to exorcise. At the heart of the manifesto lay the engine of human history: class struggle. Marx and Engels argued that the history of all hitherto existing society was the history of class struggles. They stripped away the romanticism of the past, the notions of chivalry and the divine right of kings, reducing the grand drama of civilization to a binary conflict. On one side stood the oppressors, the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie, who controlled the factories, the land, and the capital. On the other stood the oppressed, the proletariat, the wage laborers who owned nothing but their own ability to work. Through the lens of historical materialism, they argued that this struggle was not an accident of bad leadership or greedy individuals, but a structural necessity of the capitalist system. The bourgeoisie, they claimed, had revolutionized production, but in doing so, they had created their own grave diggers. By concentrating workers into massive factories and urban slums, capitalism was inadvertently forging the very tool that would destroy it: a disciplined, conscious, and unified working class. The manifesto laid out a roadmap for the inevitable. It predicted that the internal contradictions of capitalism, the constant drive for profit, the overproduction of goods, and the increasing misery of the worker, would lead to a breaking point. The proletariat would rise, seize the means of production, and abolish private property, thereby dissolving the class distinctions that had defined human existence since the dawn of time. But the manifesto was also a call to action. It moved beyond the abstract laws of history to demand immediate, radical change. It called for the abolition of land ownership, a progressive income tax, and the centralization of credit and communication in the hands of the state. It was a blueprint for a total reconfiguration of the human experience. As the document circulated, it provided more than just an explanation for the misery of the industrial age. It provided a sense of purpose. It transformed the worker from a victim of circumstance into an agent of destiny. For the first time, the masses were being told that their suffering was not a divine decree or a natural law, but a temporary condition that could and would be overthrown. The manifesto had turned a philosophical debate into a political weapon. The intellectual spark had become a manifesto, and as the revolutions of 1848 began to flicker across Europe, the world was about to learn that the specter was very, very real. London, 1864. If the Communist Manifesto was the spark, then the mid-1860s represented the moment that spark caught the dry tinder of a fragmented, disorganized labor movement. For years, the ideas of Marx and Engels had been circulating in radical pamphlets and clandestine meetings, but they lacked a centralized nervous system. The workers of Europe, the Americans, and even those in the burgeoning industrial sectors of the East were fighting isolated battles: strikes in Lyon, bread riots in London, or labor disputes in New York. But they were fighting as disconnected islands. That changed with the formation of the International Workingmen's Association, better known to history as the First International. Born out of a meeting in a London pub, the International was an ambitious, sprawling, and often chaotic attempt to unite the working class across national borders. Its mission was simple yet revolutionary: to bridge the gap between the intellectual theorists and the practical agitators. It sought to transform the specter of communism into a disciplined, global political force. The International was not a monolith. It was a volatile laboratory of radical thought. It brought together an unlikely and often clashing coalition: French Proudhonist mutualists who believed in decentralized cooperatives, British trade unionists focused on immediate wage improvements, Italian Republicans dreaming of national liberation, and most pivotally, the Marxist faction. For Karl Marx, the International was the vehicle he had been waiting for. It provided him with a platform to move his theories out of the ivory tower and into the muddy reality of street politics. He became a leading figure in the General Council, using his pen to steer the organization toward a more scientific, class-based understanding of struggle. Through the International, Marx began to argue that the workers' struggle could not be limited to mere bread and butter, issues like shorter hours or higher pay. It had to be a struggle for total political supremacy. However, organizing the global worker was a task fraught with ideological warfare. The First International became a battlefield for the soul of the movement. One of the most profound fractures occurred between the Marxists and the followers of Pierre Joseph Proudhon, the father of anarchism. While Marx argued for the necessity of a political party and the eventual seizure of state power by the proletariat, the anarchists, led by the charismatic Mikhail Bakunin, demanded the immediate abolition of all authority, including the state itself. This tension was more than just a debate over tactics. It was a fundamental disagreement over the nature of power. Could the workers use the machinery of the state to dismantle capitalism, or would the state itself become a new instrument of oppression? As the International grew, it expanded its reach, attempting to coordinate movements from the sewers of Paris to the docks of Liverpool. It proved that the working class was no longer a collection of disparate victims, but a burgeoning international community with shared interests that transcended language and borders. Yet, the very diversity that gave the International its strength also ensured its eventual fragmentation. The internal struggles between Marxists and anarchists grew too intense to contain, and as the political landscape of Europe shifted, the organization began to buckle under the weight of its own contradictions. The First International would eventually dissolve, but its legacy was permanent. It had proven that the global worker was not a myth, but a political reality, and it had set the stage for the organized, state-level revolutions that were to come. Paris, 1848. To understand why the First International was so desperate to organize, we have to look back at the moment when the theory of class struggle first collided with the brutal reality of the streets. Long before Marx had a platform in London, there was a moment when it seemed as though the world might actually change forever. It was the year of revolution. Across the European continent, a tectonic shift was occurring. From the barricades of Paris to the streets of Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest, a wave of uprisings swept through the old monarchies. The springtime of nations had arrived. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it appeared that the cracks in the old aristocratic order were widening into a chasm through which a new world might emerge. In the eyes of the burgeoning radical intellectuals, 1848 was the testing ground. The ideas of social equality and the rights of the people were no longer just whispers in coffee houses. They were being shouted from the barricades. The middle class, the bourgeoisie, had initially joined the workers in demanding constitutional reforms and an end to absolute monarchy. For a fleeting window of time, there was a sense of unified purpose, a common front against the decaying structures of the past. But as the smoke cleared from the initial skirmishes, the fundamental contradiction of the revolution revealed itself. The unity was an illusion. As the old regimes began to retreat, the interests of the various revolutionary factions began to clash violently. The bourgeoisie, having achieved their goal of political reform and constitutional rights, suddenly found themselves terrified. They realized that the same revolutionary energy they had harnessed to topple kings was now being turned against them by the industrial proletariat. The workers were no longer satisfied with the right to vote or the promise of a constitution. They were demanding bread, dignity, and a total restructuring of the economic order. The alliance fractured. The middle class, fearing the red specter of social chaos more than they hated the old monarchs, turned inward. They sought stability, property rights, and order. In many cities, the very people who had helped light the fire of revolution ended up using the state's military power to extinguish it. The revolutions were crushed. The old orders, though bloodied and shaken, proved remarkably resilient. The uprisings in Germany were suppressed by the military. The radical spirit in France was stifled by the rise of a new conservative republic, and the nationalist aspirations in Central Europe were strangled by imperial iron. For Marx and Engels, the failure of 1848 was a devastating, yet clarifying lesson. It was the moment they realized that the class struggle was not a theoretical concept to be debated in academic journals. It was a visceral, unforgiving reality. They saw that the bourgeoisie and the proletariat were not allies in a shared struggle for liberty, but irreconcilable enemies in a struggle for power. The failure of 1848 proved that spontaneous outbursts of anger were not enough to topple the capitalist engine. Revolution required more than just barricades and passion. It required organization, discipline, and a clear understanding of the political machinery. The springtime of nations had ended in a harsh, wintry crackdown, leaving behind a bitter realization. The path from theory to political reality would be long, bloody, and would require a level of global coordination that the world had never before seen. St. Petersburg, 1905. While the revolutionary fires of 1848 had been extinguished across Western Europe, a different kind of heat was building in the East. If the mid-19th century was the era of theoretical awakening, the turn of the 20th century was the era of systemic collapse, and nowhere was the foundation of the old world more decayed than in the Russian Empire. To understand the rise of the Soviet Union, we must first understand the profound, agonizing paralysis of the Tsarist autocracy. By the dawn of the 1900s, Russia was a nation caught in a violent temporal tug-of-war. On one hand, it was a sprawling, archaic empire, governed by the absolute, divine right authority of Tsar Nicholas II. It was a land of icons, traditions, and a social hierarchy that had remained largely unchanged since the Middle Ages. On the other hand, the gears of the Industrial Revolution were beginning to grind through the Russian soil, pulling the nation toward a future it was structurally incapable of handling. The socioeconomic crisis was twofold: a desperate peasantry and a burgeoning, volatile proletariat. For centuries, the backbone of Russia had been the peasant. Following the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, the peasantry was technically free, but they were economically shackled. They were burdened by redemption payments, crushing debts owed to the state for their freedom, and were squeezed onto tiny, inefficient plots of land. As the population exploded, the land became scarcer, and hunger became a permanent guest in the Russian countryside. The village commune, the mir, was suffocating under the weight of an empire that demanded taxes and soldiers, but offered no stability. Then there was the new variable, the factory. As the Tsarist government attempted to modernize through state-sponsored industrialization, massive industrial centers began to erupt in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. This created a new class of people, the industrial proletariat. These workers were concentrated in massive, cramped factories, working 14-hour days in lethal conditions for pittance wages. They were a class of people who had been uprooted from the traditional rhythms of the village and thrust into the chaotic, urban heart of capitalism, but without any of the legal protections or labor rights found in Western Europe. This demographic pressure cooker was ignited by the humiliation of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. A major power, defeated by an Asian nation, the Tsar's prestige collapsed overnight. The military failures exposed the incompetence of the Romanov bureaucracy and the systemic rot within the state. The breaking point came on a Sunday in January 1905. A peaceful procession of workers, carrying icons and petitions, marched toward the Winter Palace to ask the Tsar for basic dignity. They weren't asking for the overthrow of the monarchy. They were asking for bread and reform. But the Imperial Guard responded not with dialogue, but with lead. Bloody Sunday changed everything. The massacre of unarmed civilians shattered the myth of the Little Father, the idea that the Tsar was the benevolent protector of his people. The social contract was not just broken, it was incinerated. The empire was no longer a unified body. It was a collection of angry, hungry, and disillusioned factions, all waiting for the next spark to turn the twilight of the Tsars into a permanent darkness. St. Petersburg, 1905. The smoke from the massacre at the Winter Palace had barely cleared, and the echoes of gunfire still rang through the streets. But for one man, the chaos was not a tragedy. It was a laboratory. While the Russian masses were reacting with spontaneous, uncoordinated outbursts of rage, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history by his revolutionary pseudonym, Lenin, was formulating a cold, clinical blueprint for how to harness that rage. Lenin was not a romantic dreamer, nor was he a philosopher lost in the clouds of abstract theory. He was something far more dangerous to the established order. He was a professional revolutionary. To understand Lenin is to understand his departure from the traditional Marxist orthodoxy of the time. Marx had predicted that revolution would emerge from the most advanced capitalist societies, nations like Germany or Britain, where a massive, highly organized working class had already matured. But Russia was different. It was an agrarian, semi-feudal empire, a weak link in the global capitalist chain. Lenin realized that if the revolution was to succeed in the East, it could not wait for the slow, natural evolution of the proletariat. It had to be forced. This realization led to the birth of the Bolsheviks. In a period defined by intense factionalism within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the movement split into two distinct camps, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks, believing in a more gradual, inclusive approach, sought to work within broader coalitions and wait for the natural development of capitalism. They wanted a mass party, similar to the social democratic parties of Western Europe. Lenin, however, had no patience for the slow march of democratic consensus. In his seminal work, What is to be Done?, he argued for a vanguard party. He envisioned a tightly disciplined, secretive, and highly centralized organization composed of professional revolutionaries. These were not mere political activists. They were soldiers of ideology. They were to be the elite, the iron core that would penetrate the masses, provide them with political direction, and lead them through the storm of insurrection. This was the Bolshevik model, a hierarchy of command, a culture of absolute discipline, and a singular devotion to the seizure of power. To Lenin, the party was a weapon, and a weapon must be kept sharp, focused, and wielded by experts. This period of exile, underground printing, and intense ideological warfare transformed the Bolsheviks from a fringe splinter group into a lethal political instrument. While other revolutionaries were debating the nuances of parliamentary reform, the Bolsheviks were building a shadow state. They were studying the mechanics of power, refining their propaganda, and preparing for the moment when the structural rot of the Tsarist regime would finally cause the entire edifice to buckle. The stage was being set. The professionalism of the Bolsheviks meant that when the next crisis arrived, they would not be caught unprepared. They would not be a disorganized mob of angry workers. They would be a disciplined machine, ready to step into the vacuum of power and redefine the course of human history. The spark was coming, and Lenin was already holding the match. Petrograd, February 1917. The structural rot Lenin had predicted finally gave way. Russia was a nation being hollowed out from within by the catastrophic demands of the First World War. Millions of soldiers were dying in the mud of the Eastern Front, while back home, the cities were starving. Inflation had rendered the ruble worthless, and the bread lines in the capital had become breeding grounds for insurrection. The explosion was not a planned Bolshevik operation, but a spontaneous eruption of human misery. It began with women in textile mills striking for bread, a movement that rapidly swelled into a tidal wave of strikes, demonstrations, and mutinies. When the Tsar ordered the military to suppress the crowds with force, the machine broke. The soldiers, themselves sons of the peasantry and the proletariat, refused to fire on the masses. Instead, they turned their rifles toward their officers. In a matter of days, the centuries-old Romanov dynasty collapsed. Nicholas II, the last of the Tsars, was forced to abdicate, ending 300 years of imperial rule. But the vacuum left by the monarchy was not immediately filled by the Bolsheviks. Instead, a fragile and dysfunctional dual power emerged. On one side stood the provisional government, composed of liberal politicians and intellectuals who sought to turn Russia into a Western-style democracy. On the other stood the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers and soldiers that held the true loyalty of the streets and the barracks. The provisional government made a fatal error. They insisted on staying in the Great War to honor their international alliances. For the weary Russian population, this was an unforgivable betrayal. While the government debated constitutional law and parliamentary procedure, the Bolsheviks, now back from exile, propelled by Lenin's singular focus, began to weaponize the chaos. Lenin arrived at the Finland station with a simple, devastatingly effective slogan that bypassed complex Marxist theory and spoke directly to the gut of the nation: peace, land, and bread. It was a masterstroke of political pragmatism. To the soldiers, he promised an end to the slaughter; to the peasants, the redistribution of land; and to the starving urban workers, the food they so desperately needed. While the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries argued over the legitimacy of the provisional government, the Bolsheviks were infiltrating the Soviets, building a shadow administration within the very heart of the revolutionary movement. By October 1917, the tension reached its breaking point. The provisional government had lost all authority, and the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and organized with military precision by Leon Trotsky, moved to seize the moment. On the night of October 24th and 25th, the disciplined machine Lenin had spent decades building finally swung into action. In a series of highly coordinated strikes, Red Guards seized key infrastructure, telegraph offices, power stations, and bridges, effectively paralyzing the capital. When the Bolsheviks finally stormed the Winter Palace, it was not a massive, chaotic battle, but a surgical coup. The provisional government was dismantled, and the second workers' and peasants' government was proclaimed. The revolution had succeeded. The vanguard had seized the helm. But as the red flags rose over Petrograd, the world was about to learn that seizing power was merely the beginning. Holding it would require a descent into a darkness no one had truly anticipated. Petrograd, late 1917. The red flags were flying, but the streets were not yet silent. The Bolsheviks had seized the levers of power, but they had not yet conquered the country. In fact, the very moment the October Revolution succeeded, the fragile state they had established began to fracture under the weight of 1,000 opposing forces. The vacuum left by the Tsar, and now the vacuum left by the provisional government, was quickly filled by a storm of violence. What followed was the Russian Civil War, a brutal, multi-sided struggle that would become one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. On one side stood the Red Army, the fighting arm of the Bolsheviks, organized by Trotsky into a disciplined, ideological force. On the other stood the White Movement, a loose, disorganized, and often contradictory coalition of monarchists, capitalists, social democrats, and military officers, all united by a single desperate goal: the destruction of Bolshevism. The scale of the conflict was staggering. This was not a war of front lines and clear boundaries. It was a war of entire populations. As the Reds and Whites tore through the vast Russian landscape, they were joined by green armies, peasant insurgents fighting to protect their villages from both sides, and foreign interventionist forces from Britain, France, Japan, and the United States, who sought to crush the communist contagion before it could spread. To survive, the Bolsheviks had to adopt a policy of absolute ruthlessness. They implemented war communism, a radical economic measure that stripped the peasantry of their grain to feed the cities and the Red Army. This was not a negotiation, it was a seizure. The state took control of all industry and forcibly requisitioned food at gunpoint. To enforce this, the Cheka, the first Soviet secret police, was unleashed. The Red Terror became a tool of statecraft, used to eliminate class enemies and suppress any whisper of dissent. The goal was no longer just political victory. It was the total survival of the revolution at any cost. The years between 1918 and 1921 were a descent into chaos. Famine swept the countryside, killing millions. Disease, particularly typhus, ravaged the cities. The economy collapsed and the industrial heart of Russia ground to a halt. Yet, through sheer, bloody-minded determination and a centralized command structure, the Red Army began to prevail. They utilized the internal divisions of the White Movement against them. While the Whites fought amongst themselves over whether to restore the Tsar or establish a republic, the Reds fought with a singular, unified purpose. By 1922, the White armies had been broken, pushed back to the fringes of the empire. The Bolsheviks had won, but they had inherited a graveyard. The country was exhausted, starving, and shattered. In December of 1922, from the ruins of the old empire, a new entity was formally proclaimed: the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The USSR was not merely a new country. It was the world's first state built upon the foundation of Marxist ideology. It was a state born of fire, fueled by terror, and forged in the crucible of total war. The experiment had moved from the pages of theory into the reality of a superpower, setting the stage for a century of global confrontation. Moscow, 1921. The guns of the Civil War had finally fallen silent, but the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. The Bolsheviks had achieved the impossible. They had survived, they had conquered, and they had established the Soviet Union. But as the smoke cleared, the leaders in the Kremlin were forced to face a devastating reality. They had won the war, but they were losing the country. The policy of war communism that had sustained the Red Army had effectively broken the backbone of the Russian economy. By forcibly seizing grain from the peasantry, the state had destroyed the incentive to farm. The result was a catastrophic famine that claimed millions of lives and a complete breakdown of the urban-rural exchange. The cities were hollow shells, the factories were silent, the people were starving. The tension reached a breaking point in the countryside. The peasantry, once the silent backbone of the nation, had risen in a wave of violent, spontaneous revolts. From the Tambov Rebellion to the massive Kronstadt Rebellion, where sailors who had once been the pride and glory of the revolution turned their guns on the Bolshevik leadership. The message was clear. The people would not endure the total state control of war communism. Vladimir Lenin, the architect of the revolution, realized that the survival of the Bolshevik regime was at stake. To save the revolution, he realized, he would have to temporarily betray its purest ideals. In March 1921, at the 10th Party Congress, Lenin introduced a radical, controversial, and deeply pragmatic shift, the New Economic Policy, or the NEP. It was, in Lenin's own words, a tactical retreat. It was a strategic retreat from the precipice of total collapse, a calculated step backward into the world of capitalism in order to eventually leap forward into socialism. The NEP fundamentally altered the economic landscape of the young USSR. While the state maintained control over the commanding heights of the economy, heavy industry, banking, foreign trade, and transportation, it effectively legalized small-scale capitalism. The brutal grain requisitioning was abolished and replaced with a tax in kind. Peasants were now allowed to sell their surplus crops on the open market for profit. Small businesses and private shops were permitted to reopen. For the first time since 1917, the gears of commerce began to turn. The markets, once suppressed by ideological fervor, returned to the streets. The NEP breathed life back into the starving cities and stabilized the countryside. It created a new class of individuals, the netmen, middlemen and traders who thrived in this brief, hybrid economy. To the hardline Bolsheviks, the NEP felt like a betrayal, a sickening surrender to the very class enemies they had fought to destroy. But to Lenin, it was a necessary breathing space. It was a way to rebuild the material foundations of the state before attempting the massive leap toward a fully planned economy. The revolution had reached its most precarious moment, the realization that to build a communist future, they might first have to allow a capitalist present. Moscow, 1924. The tactical retreat of the NEP had stabilized the nation, but the heartbeat of the revolution had skipped. Vladimir Lenin, the man who had steered the Bolsheviks through the storm of civil war, was dead. His passing left a vacuum at the center of the Soviet experiment, a vacuum that would be filled not by a collective leadership, but by the calculated, ruthless ascent of Joseph Stalin. While his rivals, like Leon Trotsky, envisioned a permanent revolution that would export communism across the globe through rapid, international upheaval, Stalin proposed a different, more chilling doctrine: socialism in one country. He argued that the Soviet Union must first fortify itself, turning inward to build an impenetrable fortress of industrial and military might. For Stalin, the survival of the revolution depended on transforming a backward, agrarian nation into a modern industrial superpower at any cost. By the late 1920s, the era of compromise was over. The NEP was dismantled, and the age of the command economy began. Stalin launched his first five-year plan, a monumental and terrifying undertaking designed to leapfrog decades of development in a matter of years. The goal was total industrialization. Massive steel plants, hydroelectric dams, and vast mining complexes were to rise from the frozen earth. But this was not the organic growth of a market economy. It was a state-driven blitzkrieg. To fund this industrial miracle, the state turned its sights on the peasantry. Through a policy known as collectivization, the government moved to abolish private farming, forcing millions of peasants into massive, state-run collective farms. The goal was to strip the countryside of its resources to feed the growing cities and to export grain to buy foreign machinery. But the resistance was fierce. The peasantry, seeing their livelihoods being seized, fought back with slaughtering their livestock and burning their crops. Stalin's response was surgical and merciless. He branded the most successful farmers as kulaks, class enemies of the people, and launched a campaign of dekulakization. Millions were executed, imprisoned, or deported to the desolate reaches of Siberia. The disruption of the agricultural cycle, combined with the state's relentless grain seizures, triggered a man-made catastrophe, the Holodomor. In Ukraine and across the grain belts, millions starved to death in a silent, terrifying famine, while the state continued to export grain to fund its industrial machine. As the economy was forcibly rewired, the political landscape was being reshaped through terror. This was the birth of true totalitarianism. The state sought not just obedience, but total psychological and social control. The secret police, the NKVD, became the eyes and ears of the Kremlin. Through the Great Purge of the 1930s, Stalin turned the revolution inward, consuming its own. Old Bolsheviks, military officers, and intellectuals were arrested, interrogated, and executed in a paranoid quest to eliminate any perceived threat to his absolute authority. The Soviet Union was being transformed. The cities were growing, the factories were roaring, and the industrial output was skyrocketing. On paper, the miracle was working. But the foundation of this new superpower was built upon a bedrock of coercion, mass graves, and the absolute suppression of the individual. The tactical retreat had ended. The era of the iron fist had begun. Moscow, 1919. While Stalin was busy fortifying the Soviet state from within, a different kind of machinery was already in motion outside its borders. To ensure that the Russian Revolution was not merely a local phenomenon, but the opening salvo of a global conflagration, the Bolsheviks established the Third International, better known as the Comintern. The Comintern was not merely a diplomatic body. It was a centralized, global command center for revolution. Its mission was clear: to coordinate the activities of communist parties around the world and to transform them into disciplined, professional revolutionary cells directed by the Kremlin. For the first time in history, a single state was attempting to manage a worldwide political movement from a central headquarters. The Comintern demanded absolute loyalty to the Soviet model, effectively turning the international working class into an extension of Soviet foreign policy. As the 1920s progressed, the Comintern's influence rippled outward, finding fertile ground in the cracks of crumbling colonial empires and the growing disillusionment of the post-war West. In Europe, the Comintern fueled the growth of radical movements in Germany, France, and Italy, seeking to capitalize on the economic instability of the era. In Asia and Africa, the message of anti-imperialism resonated deeply. To many colonized peoples, communism offered more than just an economic theory. It offered a weapon against the European masters who had stripped their lands of wealth for centuries. However, the Comintern's one-size-fits-all approach often created friction. The directive from Moscow frequently ignored the specific cultural and social realities of the nations it sought to influence. This tension became a defining characteristic of the movement, the struggle between local revolutionary needs and the rigid, centralized demands of the Soviet center. By the time the 1930s arrived, the ideological landscape had shifted. The Comintern strategy fluctuated wildly, from calling for class against class warfare, where social democrats were branded as social fascists, to the sudden, confusing pivot toward popular fronts, where communists were encouraged to ally with liberal democrats to combat the rising tide of Nazi Germany. This volatility often left foreign communist parties paralyzed, waiting for a signal from Moscow that might never come, or one that would contradict their own survival. As the shadow of the Second World War loomed, the Comintern had become a double-edged sword. It had successfully exported the revolutionary spark, establishing communist parties in nearly every corner of the globe, from the docks of London to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Yet, it had also tethered these movements to the survival of the Soviet Union. The fate of the global revolution was no longer in the hands of local workers. It was tied to the geopolitical fortunes of the Kremlin. The machinery of global influence was now fully operational. The seeds of revolution had been sown across continents, but as the world drifted toward a total war that would redraw the map of the Earth, the question was no longer just about how communism would spread, but where it would take root once the smoke of battle cleared. The stage was set for a shift in the center of gravity, a movement away from the industrial heartlands of Europe and toward the agrarian landscapes of the East. Changsha, China, 1921. As the Comintern's directives echoed through the halls of European meeting rooms, a different, more primal energy was gathering in the vast, rural expanses of the East. While the Soviet model looked toward the factory, the smokestacks, and the urban proletariat as the sole engines of history, the leaders of the nascent Chinese Communist Party faced a crushing reality. China was not an industrial powerhouse. It was a sprawling, fractured empire of peasants, defined not by the rhythmic clatter of machines, but by the ancient, grueling toil of the soil. In the orthodox Marxist view, the peasantry was often dismissed as a reactionary force, a conservative mass tied to tradition and land ownership, lacking the revolutionary consciousness of the urban worker. According to the Soviet playbook, revolution was meant to happen in the cities, with the workers seizing the means of production and the peasants merely following in their wake. But in China, there were almost no industrial workers to lead such a charge. To follow the Moscow script strictly was to ensure that the revolution would wither and die in the streets of Shanghai before it could ever reach the heart of the country. Enter Mao Zedong. A scholar turned revolutionary, Mao possessed a keen, pragmatic understanding of the contradictions facing his nation. He looked at the vast, disenfranchised population of hundreds of millions of farmers, starving, oppressed by warlords and crushed by foreign imperialism, and saw something the theorists in Moscow had missed. He saw that the peasantry was not a secondary force, but the primary revolutionary force. Mao's genius and his great deviation from Marxist orthodoxy lay in his ability to redefine the class struggle. He realized that in an agrarian society, the proletariat did not have to be the factory worker. It could be the peasant. The struggle was not merely about the ownership of machines, but about the ownership of land. By centering the revolution on land reform, Mao provided a tangible, life-altering goal for the rural masses. He turned the struggle for survival into a struggle for political power. This was more than a tactical shift. It was a fundamental reimagining of communist theory. Maoism proposed that a revolution could be fueled by the sheer, concentrated willpower of the rural masses, using the countryside to encircle and eventually choke the cities. This protracted people's war would rely on the peasant as the soldier, the provider, and the ideological backbone of the movement. However, this deviation came with a heavy price. It placed the Chinese Communist Party on a collision course not only with the nationalist Kuomintang, but also with the very institution that provided their legitimacy, the Comintern. As Mao began to look toward the village rather than the factory, he began to forge a path that was uniquely Chinese, a path that would eventually challenge the hegemony of the Soviet model itself. The revolution was no longer a predictable byproduct of industrialization. It had become something more volatile, more organic, and far more unpredictable. The focus of the global struggle was shifting from the iron and steel of the West to the dust and grain of the East, setting the stage for a transformation that would reshape the 20th century. Jiangxi Province, China, 1934. The theoretical reimagining of the revolution was about to face its most brutal existential test. For years, the Chinese Communist Party had attempted to build rural Soviets, carving out small pockets of revolutionary territory amidst a sea of chaos. But by the mid-1930s, the dream of a peasant-led uprising was under siege. The Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had launched a series of massive encirclement campaigns designed to systematically crush the communist strongholds. The Red Army, once a growing force of ideological believers, was now a cornered animal, trapped by superior nationalist firepower and a relentless blockade. The situation was catastrophic. The CCP was being squeezed from all sides, and the traditional urban-centric strategies of their Soviet advisors were failing in the rugged, mountainous terrain of the Chinese interior. To survive, the party had to do more than just fight. They had to vanish. In October 1934, the order was given. What followed would become one of the most legendary, harrowing, and transformative episodes in the history of modern warfare: the Long March. This was not a tactical retreat. It was a desperate 6,000-mile odyssey through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The Red Army, numbering roughly 80,000 to 100,000 soldiers, began a frantic flight from their base in Jiangxi, moving north and west to evade the nationalist pursuit. They moved through frozen mountains, treacherous marshes, and blistering plains, constantly under fire, constantly hungry, and constantly dying. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion were as lethal as any bullet. By the time the remnants of the army reached the remote province of Yan'an, only a few thousand survivors remained. On paper, the Long March was a near-total military disaster. The CCP had lost the vast majority of its personnel and its established bases. But in the crucible of this retreat, something unexpected happened. The party found its soul. The march acted as a massive, mobile political school. As the soldiers moved through different provinces, they didn't just fight. They interacted with the local peasantry. They implemented Mao's vision on the move, distributing land, treating villagers with respect, and spreading the message of a new social order. The protracted People's War, was no longer just a theory discussed in secret meetings. It was being lived out in every village the Red Army passed through. Most importantly, the Long March facilitated a seismic shift in the party's internal hierarchy. During the Zunyi Conference in 1935, held amidst the chaos of the retreat, Mao Zedong successfully challenged the dominance of the pro-Soviet leaders who had insisted on conventional military tactics. He seized control of the party's direction, cementing his status as the undisputed architect of the Chinese Revolution. The Long March had transformed the CCP from a fractured group of urban intellectuals and struggling guerrillas into a hardened, disciplined, and ideologically unified force. It had turned a near-extinction event into a foundational myth. The survivors who emerged from the dust of the march were no longer just soldiers. They were the vanguard of a new era. They had proven that the revolution could survive even when stripped of its territory, provided it carried its ideology within the hearts of the people. The stage was set. The foundation was laid. The Red Dragon was finally beginning to stir. Tiananmen Square, Beijing, October 1, 1949. The air was thick with a sense of historical inevitability. Standing atop the massive stone podium of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, Mao Zedong looked out over a sea of red flags and cheering masses. His voice, steady and resonant, carried a message that would fundamentally alter the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. The Chinese people have stood up. With those words, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed. The era of the century of humiliation, a period marked by foreign imperialism, warlordism, and internal collapse, was declared over. For the Chinese Communist Party, this was the ultimate vindication of the Long March, the survival of Yan'an, and the relentless, grinding struggle against both the nationalists and the Japanese occupation. But how did the CCP, once a fractured group of guerrilla fighters hiding in the mountains, ascend to the total control of the world's most populous nation? The answer lay in the catastrophic failure of the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. While the communists had spent the years of the Second Sino-Japanese War building a grassroots network among the peasantry, the Kuomintang had become increasingly hollowed out. Corruption, hyperinflation, and a perceived inability to protect the people from Japanese aggression had eroded the nationalists' legitimacy. When the Civil War resumed in earnest following Japan's surrender in 1945, the momentum was irreversible. The People's Liberation Army did not just win through superior numbers. They won through a sophisticated synthesis of Maoist military doctrine and psychological warfare. They utilized the protracted People's War strategy to turn the tide, moving from rural encirclement to urban capture. By 1949, the nationalist defenses were crumbling under the weight of massive communist offensives. Chiang Kai-shek and his retreating forces were forced to flee to the island of Taiwan, leaving the mainland to the Red Banner. The proclamation of the PRC was not merely a change in government. It was a total structural overhaul. The new regime immediately began the task of dismantling the old feudal and capitalist systems. Land reform was implemented with a ferocity that upended centuries of social hierarchy, redistributing land from wealthy landlords to the peasants who had long toiled upon it. This was the practical application of Mao's theory. The peasant was no longer a passive subject of history, but the engine of the revolution. However, the triumph of 1949 also brought the immediate shadow of the Cold War. The United States, seeing the rise of a massive communist state on its doorstep, viewed the event as a catastrophic shift in the global balance of power. The loss of China would become a lightning rod for political fury in Washington, fueling the paranoia and containment policies that would define the coming decades. As the celebrations in Tiananmen Square reached a crescendo, the reality of governing a vast, fractured, and war-torn nation began to set in. The CCP had won the war, but the struggle to build a new society, a socialist utopia carved out of the ruins of empire, was only just beginning. The Red Dragon had not just stirred, it had taken flight, and the world would never be the same. Beijing, China, 1958. The initial euphoria of the revolution had begun to harden into a singular, obsessive drive for progress. Mao Zedong, ever the radical visionary, was no longer content with merely consolidating the revolution. He sought to leapfrog over the traditional stages of industrial development. He wanted to bypass decades of slow, incremental growth and catapult China directly into the ranks of the world's great industrial powers. This was the birth of the Great Leap Forward. The ideology was as ambitious as it was dangerous. Maoism posited that the sheer willpower of the masses, fueled by revolutionary fervor, could overcome any material deficiency. To harness this energy, the state dismantled the traditional village structure, replacing it with massive, self-sufficient people's communes. These were not merely farms, but entire social ecosystems where private property was abolished. Eating was centralized in communal kitchens, and every aspect of life, from labor to leisure, was directed by the party. The goal was twofold: to achieve massive agricultural surpluses to fund industrialization, and to transform China into an industrial titan through a process known as backyard steel production. In every corner of the countryside, peasants were ordered to build makeshift furnaces. They melted down everything of value, cooking pots, tools, even door handles, to produce steel. But this steel was a hollow victory. It was brittle, impure, and utterly useless for construction or manufacturing. While the peasants labored over these smoldering heaps, the actual crops in the fields were left to rot, neglected by a workforce redirected toward a phantom industry. As the state's central planners demanded increasingly impossible quotas, a deadly feedback loop was created. Local officials, terrified of being branded as rightists or counter-revolutionaries, began to report record-breaking harvests that simply did not exist. These falsified numbers, fueled by political terror and the desire to please the leadership, convinced Beijing that China was experiencing an agricultural miracle. In response, the state increased grain requisitions, seizing the very seed grain and subsistence food needed to sustain the peasantry. By 1959, the miracle had turned into a nightmare. The Great Famine, the deadliest man-made catastrophe in human history, began to take hold. The scale of the horror was incomprehensible. As the grain disappeared into state silos and export markets, millions of people were left with nothing. In the provinces, the social fabric of rural China disintegrated. Reports emerged of widespread starvation, disease, and even instances of cannibalism. The Great Leap had become a Great Descent. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly among historians, but most agree that between 30 and 45 million people perished from hunger and related causes. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the famine was not the result of a natural disaster, but of a systemic failure of command. The combination of radical social engineering, the destruction of traditional farming expertise, and a political culture that criminalized dissent meant that no one could stop the momentum of the disaster. The Red Dragon had attempted to fly toward a socialist utopia, but in its frantic, uncoordinated flapping, it had instead crushed the very people it claimed to liberate. Beijing, China, 1966. If the Great Leap Forward was a catastrophic failure of economic planning, what followed would be a systematic assault on the very soul of Chinese society. By the mid-1960s, Mao Zedong found himself in a precarious political position. The famine had left the nation scarred, and more importantly, the pragmatic policies introduced by other party leaders to stabilize the economy had begun to work. This moderation threatened Mao's vision. To the radical leader, the emergence of expert, bureaucrats and revisionist officials was a sign that the revolution was losing its revolutionary spirit. He feared that China was sliding back toward capitalism, creating a new elite class that would replace the old landlords. Mao decided that the solution was not to fix the economy, but to destroy the existing social and political order entirely. He launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. His weapon of choice was not the army or the state bureaucracy, but the youth. Mao issued a call to the Red Guards, students and teenagers fueled by a cult of personality that had reached fever pitch. His message was simple: to rebel is justified. He encouraged the younger generation to attack the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. What followed was a descent into choreographed chaos. Across the nation, Red Guard units descended upon temples, museums, and libraries, smashing ancient artifacts and burning centuries of history in a frantic attempt to purge China of its feudal past. But the violence was not confined to relics. It turned inward toward the people. Teachers, intellectuals, scientists, and even high-ranking Communist Party officials were branded as class enemies. They were subjected to struggle sessions, public humiliations where they were forced to confess crimes against the revolution, often while being beaten, spat upon, or physically assaulted by their own students and neighbors. The traditional hierarchies of respect, family, and education were incinerated. In the vacuum left by the breakdown of law and order, paranoia became the primary currency of survival. To question a directive was to invite suspicion. To show doubt was to invite death. As the country spiraled into this ideological whirlwind, the economy ground to a halt. Factories were shuttered by political strikes. Schools were closed as students traded textbooks for little red books, and the intellectual life of the nation was effectively decapitated. The brightest minds of a generation were sent to the countryside to undergo re-education through hard manual labor, stripping the nation of the very expertise required to rebuild from the ruins of the Great Famine. The Cultural Revolution proved a terrifying thesis. That ideology could be prioritized even over the survival of the state itself. Mao had successfully reclaimed his absolute power, but the cost was a decade of profound trauma. The social fabric of China was not just torn, it was rewoven into a pattern of suspicion and zealotry. The pursuit of a pure, utopian society had resulted in a landscape of broken traditions, shattered lives, and a nation that had been forced to turn its back on its own history in the name of a future that refused to arrive. Yalta, Crimea, 1945. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of World War II, the world did not find peace, but rather a profound and terrifying reconfiguration of power. While the Allied leaders, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, met to discuss the post-war order, the lines of a new geopolitical struggle were being drawn in the very dirt of Europe. The war had ended the reign of fascism, but it had simultaneously cleared the stage for a titanic confrontation between two irreconcilable visions of humanity: liberal capitalism and Marxist-Leninist communism. With the Red Army physically occupying much of Central and Eastern Europe as they pushed toward Berlin, the Soviet Union found itself in a position of unprecedented strategic advantage. Joseph Stalin, haunted by the memory of two devastating invasions from the West, sought not just a buffer zone, but a sphere of influence that would ensure Soviet security forever. What followed was the systematic imposition of communist regimes across a vast swath of the continent, creating what Winston Churchill would famously, and chillingly, term the Iron Curtain. This was not merely a line on a map. It was a physical and ideological barrier that descended across Europe, separating the democratic West from the Soviet-dominated East. In nations like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, the transition to communism was rarely a spontaneous uprising of the proletariat. Instead, it was often a calculated process of salami tactics, the gradual slicing away of political opposition by Soviet-backed local communist parties. Through rigged elections, the suppression of dissent, and the infiltration of the police apparatus, the old democratic structures were dismantled piece by piece until only the Communist Party remained. These nations became satellite states, technically sovereign, yet tethered to Moscow by an invisible but unbreakable umbilical cord. Their economies were restructured through forced collectivization and state-directed industrialization, modeled strictly after the Soviet command system. Their foreign policies were dictated by the Kremlin, and their internal security was often overseen by secret police forces that mirrored the NKVD. The dream of national self-determination, which had fueled the resistance against Nazi Germany, was effectively smothered by the reality of Soviet hegemony. The most potent symbol of this divide was the division of Germany itself. Berlin, situated deep within the Soviet zone, became a microcosm of the entire global struggle. As the West attempted to rebuild through the Marshall Plan, the East became a closed circuit of planned economies and ideological conformity. The Iron Curtain created a bifurcated reality. In the West, the post-war era was defined by the reconstruction of liberal democracy and the expansion of consumer markets. In the East, life was defined by the state. The individual was subsumed by the collective, the market was replaced by the quota, and the freedom of movement was replaced by the watchful eye of the border guard. This was the birth of a bipolar world, a period of Cold War, where the threat of total annihilation loomed over every diplomatic maneuver. The stage was set for a decades-long chess match, where the pawns were entire nations, and the prize was the ideological soul of the modern world. June 25, 1950, the Korean Peninsula. While the Iron Curtain had effectively frozen the geopolitical struggle in Europe, the tension of the Cold War was about to undergo a violent, kinetic transformation. The Cold War was about to turn very, very hot. For years, the Korean Peninsula had been a fractured land, split at the 38th parallel by the arbitrary decisions of post-war administrators. In the north, Kim Il-sung had established a rigid Stalinist state, fueled by Soviet support and a fervent desire to unify the peninsula under a communist banner. In the south, Syngman Rhee maintained a staunchly anti-communist, albeit authoritarian, regime backed by the United States. For a moment, it seemed the peninsula might remain a frozen stalemate, a miniature version of the European divide. But in the early hours of a June morning, the stalemate shattered. North Korean forces, bolstered by Soviet weaponry and tactical planning, launched a massive, coordinated invasion across the 38th parallel. This was not a mere border skirmish. It was a full-scale war of movement designed to crush the South and bring the entire peninsula into the communist fold. The world watched in shock. To the Western powers, this was not an isolated civil war. It was a clear signal of Soviet-directed expansionism. The logic of containment, the American doctrine of preventing the spread of communism at any cost, was suddenly put to its most brutal test. The United Nations, in an unprecedented move, authorized a military response, leading to a massive intervention led by the United States. What followed was a terrifying pendulum of momentum. The North Korean People's Army swept almost the entire peninsula into their grasp, pushing the democratic forces into a tiny pocket at the southern tip of Pusan. Then came the counterstroke. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding UN forces, executed a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, severing North Korean supply lines and sending the tide of war crashing back toward the Yalu River, near the Chinese border. This surge toward the border triggered the second great complication of the conflict. Fearing a U.S.-aligned state on its doorstep, the newly established People's Republic of China intervened, sending hundreds of thousands of volunteers into the fray. The war transformed from a localized conflict into a massive, multinational collision of ideologies. The fighting became a grueling war of attrition in the frozen mountains and rugged valleys of Korea. It was a conflict defined by extreme brutality, where the ideological lines were drawn in blood, and the civilian populations were caught in the crushing gears of superpower competition. By the time an armistice was signed in 1953, the borders had returned almost exactly to where they began. The war had ended in a bloody draw, leaving the peninsula divided, devastated, and permanently militarized. But the true impact of the Korean War was far more profound than a mere ceasefire. It proved that the Cold War would not be confined to the halls of diplomacy or the shadows of espionage. It proved that the struggle between capitalism and communism could, and would, ignite devastating, high-intensity wars in the developing world. The era of the proxy war had arrived, and the world realized that the struggle for ideological supremacy would be a global and potentially apocalyptic endeavor. January 1, 1959, Havana, Cuba. If the Korean War proved that the Cold War could ignite devastating conflicts in the East, the revolution in Cuba would prove that the ideological battlefield had finally reached the doorstep of the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the United States had viewed the Caribbean as its own backyard, a sphere of influence defined by economic interests and political stability. But the winds of change were blowing through the tropical air of the Caribbean, and they carried with them a radical, revolutionary fervor that would threaten to upend the entire Western order. The seeds of this upheaval were sown not in a Soviet boardroom, but in the rugged Sierra Maestra Mountains. For years, a young, charismatic lawyer named Fidel Castro had waged a guerrilla campaign against the U.S.-backed, authoritarian regime of Fulgencio Batista. To the locals, Castro's 26th of July movement represented a promise of land reform, social justice, and an end to the crushing inequality that had defined Cuban life. But as the movement gained momentum, The question of its ultimate destination became the most critical variable in the geopolitical equation. When Batista fled Havana in the early hours of New Year's Day, 1959, the world watched with bated breath. Initially, the revolution was seen by many in the West as a nationalist uprising, a localized struggle for sovereignty rather than a march toward Marxism-Leninism. However, as Castro consolidated power, the trajectory of the new government shifted with startling speed. The implementation of radical agrarian reforms, the nationalization of foreign-owned industries, and the sudden, aggressive crackdown on political dissent signaled a transformation that was far from merely nationalist. By 1960, the ideological alignment of the island became undeniable. As the United States responded with economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation, Cuba found itself drifting toward the only superpower willing to offer a lifeline, the Soviet Union. This was the moment the Cold War truly went global. The presence of a communist state just 90 miles from the Florida coast was an intolerable reality for Washington. It was no longer just a struggle for influence in Asia or Europe. It was a direct challenge to the security of the American mainland. The tension reached a fever pitch in October 1961, when the failed U.S.-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs humiliated the Kennedy administration and drove Castro even deeper into the arms of Nikita Khrushchev. The revolution had successfully exported the concept of armed struggle to the Americas, forcing the United States into a posture of permanent vigilance. This culminated in the most terrifying moment of the nuclear age, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. For 13 days, the world stood on the precipice of total annihilation as the two superpowers stared each other down over the placement of Soviet nuclear warheads on Cuban soil. Though the crisis was eventually resolved through back-channel diplomacy, the damage to the global status quo was permanent. Cuba had become more than just an island. It had become a permanent outpost of the communist world in the West. The revolution had fundamentally altered the geography of the Cold War, proving that even in the shadow of the American superpower, the red flag could be raised, and the struggle for ideological supremacy would never truly be contained. 1956, Moscow, Soviet Union. As the Cuban Missile Crisis subsided, leaving the world breathless and the geopolitical map fundamentally altered, a different kind of storm was brewing, not in the Caribbean, but in the heart of the communist world itself. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the monolith of global communism, once thought to be a unified, unbreakable front led by the Kremlin, was beginning to crack. To understand this fracture, we must look to the shifting winds in Moscow. In 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered his secret speech, denouncing the cult of personality and the crimes of Joseph Stalin. To much of the world, this was a move toward de-Stalinization and a more moderate path. But to Mao Zedong, the leader of the newly established People's Republic of China, this was nothing short of ideological treason. Mao saw Khrushchev's new course as revisionism, a watering down of revolutionary purity that threatened to betray the very essence of Marxism-Leninism. To the Chinese leadership, the Soviet Union was no longer the infallible elder brother of the communist movement. It was becoming a cautious, bureaucratic state more concerned with peaceful coexistence with the West than with the global triumph of the proletariat. The tension was not merely philosophical, it was deeply personal and intensely nationalistic. China, having emerged from decades of war and humiliation, was no longer content to be a junior partner in a Soviet-dominated bloc. Mao sought to position China as the true vanguard of the revolution, the leader of the developing, agrarian nations of the Third World, that the Soviet Union seemed increasingly eager to ignore. By the late 1950s, the friction had moved from hushed whispers in diplomatic corridors to open hostility. The two giants began to compete for the soul of the international communist movement. They vied for influence in Southeast Asia, Africa, and among various splinter parties in Europe. The Cominform, the organization intended to coordinate global communist activity, became a battlefield where Moscow and Beijing fought for legitimacy. The split turned from a diplomatic disagreement into a geopolitical reality in the early 1960s. Border skirmishes erupted along the long, rugged frontier between the two nations, and the rhetoric escalated into vitriolic propaganda. The monolith was dead. In its place stood a bipolar communist world, a schism that would have profound consequences for the Cold War. The Sino-Soviet split fundamentally changed the calculus of global politics. The United States, observing this rift, realized that the communist bloc was not a single, unified enemy, but a collection of competing interests. This realization eventually paved the way for the era of triangular diplomacy, most notably seen in Richard Nixon's historic opening to China in 1972. But for the communist movement, the cost was devastating. The split weakened the collective strength of the Eastern Bloc and fueled internal purges and radicalism within China, contributing to the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. The fracture proved that even the most rigid ideologies are subject to the realities of power, ego, and the relentless pursuit of national sovereignty. The Red Star was no longer a single light. It had splintered into a constellation of competing ambitions. 1960, Hanoi, North Vietnam. As the ideological rift between Moscow and Beijing widened, the battlefield for their competing visions of revolution shifted away from the halls of diplomacy and into the jungles and mountains of the global South. The era of the monolith had ended, replaced by a volatile, multipolar struggle where the developing world became the primary theater of the Cold War. If the superpowers were unwilling to risk direct nuclear annihilation, they would fight through others. They would fight through proxies. Nowhere was this more evident or more devastating than in Indochina. For decades, Vietnam had been a crucible of resistance against colonial rule. But as the French withdrew, the struggle evolved. It was no longer just a war of national liberation. It had become a central pillar of the global ideological contest. In the North, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh, guided by Marxist-Leninist principles, sought to unify the country under a communist banner. In the South, a government backed by the United States stood as a bulwark against the red tide. The Vietnam War became the ultimate proxy conflict. For the United States, it was a desperate attempt to contain the domino theory, the fear that if one nation fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. For the communist bloc, it was a chance to prove their revolutionary mettle. However, the Sino-Soviet split meant that even here, the support was fractured. While the Soviet Union provided advanced anti-aircraft missiles and heavy machinery, China provided manpower, small arms, and a different, more agrarian model of guerrilla warfare. Hanoi, caught in the middle, became a master at playing these two giants against one another to secure the aid necessary for survival. But Vietnam was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the blueprint for a new kind of conflict that would sweep across the global South. From the highlands of Laos to the jungles of Cambodia, the The struggle between capitalist containment and communist expansion was tearing the fabric of post-colonial nations apart. In Africa, the winds of change were blowing. As empires collapsed, new states emerged, and with them, a desperate search for an alternative to Western capitalism. In nations like Angola and Mozambique, liberation movements fought bitter civil wars, fueled by Soviet weaponry and Chinese ideological training. In these conflicts, the local struggle for independence was often subsumed by the larger, more cynical mechanics of the Cold War. The Third World was no longer just a collection of emerging nations. It was a chessboard. This was the era of the revolutionary export. Communism was no longer just a European phenomenon of factory workers and urban proletariats. It had been reimagined, largely through the lens of Maoism, as a weapon for the peasant, the guerrilla, and the anti-colonial insurgent. The ideology had traveled from the industrial heartlands of the West to the tropical periphery of the East and South. Yet this spread came at a staggering human cost. The proxy wars of the mid-20th century ensured that while the superpowers remained in a state of cold peace, the developing world was locked in a state of hot war. The scars left by these conflicts, the decimated landscapes of Vietnam, the fractured societies of sub-Saharan Africa, and the destabilized politics of Latin America would haunt the global order for generations to come. The revolution had gone global, but it had arrived through fire and blood. 1968, Prague, Czechoslovakia. While the world's eyes were fixed on the smoke rising from the jungles of Southeast Asia, a different, more insidious crisis was beginning to fester within the heart of the Eastern Bloc. In the spring of 1968, a wave of liberalization known as the Prague Spring swept through Czechoslovakia. Led by Alexander Dubček, the government attempted to implement socialism with a human face, a tentative experiment in loosening censorship, allowing freedom of speech, and introducing elements of democratic reform. To the West, it looked like a breath of fresh air. To the Kremlin, it looked like an existential threat. The Soviet leadership, now firmly under the control of Leonid Brezhnev, viewed any deviation from the Moscow-mandated orthodoxy as a crack in the foundation of the entire socialist edifice. They feared that if one satellite state were allowed to drift toward reform, the entire Warsaw Pact would unravel like a loose thread. The response was swift, heavy, and uncompromising. In August, Soviet-led tanks rolled into the streets of Prague, crushing the reform movement under the weight of armored steel. This intervention codified a new, chilling principle of international relations, the Brezhnev Doctrine. It asserted that the sovereignty of individual socialist states was secondary to the interests of the socialist community as a whole. In plain terms, it meant that the Soviet Union reserved the right to intervene militarily in any Eastern Bloc nation where capitalism or counter-revolutionary forces threatened the communist monopoly on power. The doctrine effectively turned the satellite states into permanent protectorates, transforming the Iron Curtain from a defensive line into a cage. But while Brezhnev was busy tightening the grip on Eastern Europe, the internal machinery of the Soviet Union itself was beginning to grind to a halt. This would become known as the era of stagnation. For decades, the Soviet model had relied on intensive, command-driven growth, building massive factories, damming rivers, and mobilizing millions of workers towards singular, state-defined goals. This worked during the rapid industrialization of the Stalin years and the post-war reconstruction. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, The easy gains of extensive growth had been exhausted. The Soviet economy had reached its structural limits. The central planning apparatus, a sprawling Byzantine bureaucracy, proved incapable of managing the complexities of a modern, high-tech economy. While the West was entering the digital age, fueled by the silicon chip and consumer-driven innovation, the Soviet Union remained tethered to heavy industry and coal. Decisions were made not by market demand or technological necessity, but by quotas set in Moscow, often months or years in advance. This led to a surreal landscape of chronic shortages, long lines for basic bread, a lack of consumer goods, and a massive shadow economy of black markets that became the only way for citizens to survive. The social contract of the era was one of quiet, weary compliance. The state provided stability, guaranteed employment, and cheap, basic necessities, and in exchange, the people accepted political passivity and the absence of true freedom. But beneath the surface, the rot was spreading. Scientific progress slowed, corruption became systemic, and a profound sense of cynicism settled over the populace. The revolutionary fervor of 1917 had been replaced by a crushing, gray inertia. The Soviet superpower appeared formidable on the world stage, a nuclear titan projecting power from the Hindu Kush to the streets of Prague, but internally, its heart was slowing. The engine of communism was running out of steam. 1975, Moscow, Soviet Union. If the tanks in Prague were the external symptom of a failing system, the empty shelves in Moscow were its internal diagnosis. By the mid-1970s, the myth of the infallible socialist machine was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own complexity. The era of stagnation was no longer a looming threat. It was a lived reality for millions. To understand why the Soviet engine was stalling, one must understand the fundamental flaw of the command economy, the information problem. In a market economy, prices act as signals. They tell producers what people want and tell consumers what is scarce. In the Soviet model, those signals were silenced. Instead, the economy was directed by the Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. This was a gargantuan, centralized bureaucracy tasked with the impossible, calculating the production needs for millions of individual goods, from the number of left-foot boots required in Vladivostok to the specific grade of steel needed for a tractor factory in Ukraine. The scale was mathematically insurmountable, because the planners in Moscow could never truly know the real-time needs or changing preferences of 100 million citizens. The system was perpetually out of sync. This created a surreal, schizophrenic economic landscape. On one hand, the state could successfully launch a Sputnik or build a massive hydroelectric dam, projects where the goals were singular and the resources were concentrated. But on the other hand, the system failed at the micro level. This failure manifested in a cycle of chronic absurdity. Factories would meet their gross output quotas by producing thousands of heavy, useless items simply because the quota was measured in weight rather than utility. Workers often had no incentive to innovate or work efficiently because the state guaranteed employment regardless of quality, and because any sudden increase in productivity might simply result in even more punishingly high quotas the following year. In many ways, the Soviet worker lived by a grim, unofficial proverb: "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work." As the quality of life stagnated, a massive second economy emerged. This was the black market, a sprawling shadow network of bribery, theft, and illicit trade. If you wanted a spare part for a car, a decent cut of meat, or even a pair of quality jeans, you didn't go to a state store. You knew a guy who knew a guy. This shadow economy became the grease that kept the gears of society turning, but it also acted as a slow-acting poison, eroding the state's authority and fostering a culture of systemic corruption. While the Soviet Union poured its dwindling resources into the arms race and the maintenance of its global empire, the domestic foundation was hollowing out. The technological gap between the East and the West was widening into a chasm. While the West was experiencing the green revolution in agriculture and the dawn of the microchip, the Soviet Union was struggling to modernize its aging industrial base. The superpower was caught in a fatal paradox. It possessed enough nuclear firepower to destroy the world, but it could no longer reliably provide its citizens with a reliable washing machine. The economic malaise was more than just a dip in growth. It was a crisis of legitimacy. The promise of a post-scarcity utopia had been replaced by a reality of scarcity, and the silent resentment of a weary population was beginning to simmer beneath the surface of the gray, stagnant landscape. January 1968, Prague, Czechoslovakia. While the Soviet Union was beginning its long, slow descent into economic stagnation, a different kind of tremor was shaking the foundations of the Eastern Bloc. It was not a tremor of empty shelves, but a tremor of ideas. This was the Prague Spring, a period of political liberalization that would prove, once and for all, the terrifying rigidity of the Soviet system. The catalyst was Alexander Dubček, a reformist leader who rose to power within the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. Dubček did not seek to overthrow communism or invite capitalism into the heart of Europe. Instead, he sought to humanize it. He spoke of socialism with a human face. His vision was a delicate, almost impossible tightrope walk. He wanted to preserve the one-party rule and the centralized economy, but he wanted to marry them to freedom of speech, freedom of travel, and the end of the suffocating censorship that had defined life under Stalinism. For a few brief, intoxicating months, it felt as though the impossible might actually work. The press began to report on the real problems of the state. Students debated philosophy in the streets, and the crushing fear that had kept citizens silent for decades began to evaporate. For the people of Prague, it felt like a rebirth. For the Kremlin, however, it felt like a contagion. To the aging leadership in Moscow, particularly Leonid Brezhnev, the Prague Spring was not a domestic reform. It was a geopolitical existential threat. The Soviet doctrine was built on the principle of limited sovereignty for its satellite states. This meant that any nation within the Warsaw Pact was not truly independent. Its political structure was a matter of Soviet security. If Czechoslovakia were allowed to loosen the grip of the party, would Poland follow? Would East Germany? Would the entire ideological dam burst? The Soviet response was swift and brutal. On the night of August 20, 1968, the illusion of socialism with a human face was crushed under the treads of hundreds of Warsaw Pact tanks. Soviet and Allied troops rolled into Prague, turning the streets into a battlefield. Dubček and his reformers were arrested and flown to Moscow, where they were forced to sign away their reforms in exchange for their political survival. The aftermath of the Prague Spring was a profound psychological blow to the global communist movement. It signaled the arrival of the Brezhnev Doctrine, the explicit policy that the Soviet Union reserved the right to intervene militarily in any socialist country where the communist regime was perceived to be under threat. The lesson was clear. You could reform the economy, you could improve the standard of living, and you could even soften the edges of social control. But you could never, under any circumstances, touch the monopoly of the Communist Party. The limits of reform had been drawn in blood. This crushing of dissent didn't solve the underlying problems. It merely suppressed them. It drove the desire for change underground, transforming political disagreement into deep-seated systemic resentment. As the tanks rolled out of Prague, they left behind a legacy of cynicism. The people saw that the system was not designed to evolve or to serve them, but to preserve itself at any cost. The Prague Spring had proved that while communism could be reformed, it could not be redeemed. March 1985, Moscow, Soviet Union. For nearly 2 decades, the Soviet Union had been trapped in what historians call the era of stagnation. The grand promises of the Bolsheviks had been replaced by a grinding, bureaucratic inertia. The economy was a rusted machine, unable to keep pace with the digital revolution sweeping the West. The central planners were blind, the factories were inefficient, and the social contract, the unspoken agreement that the state would provide stability in exchange for obedience, was fraying at the edges. Into this atmosphere of decay stepped Mikhail Gorbachev. Unlike the geriatric, stone-faced leaders who preceded him, Gorbachev was young, charismatic, and possessed a terrifying realization. If the Soviet system did not change, it would cease to exist. He did not set out to destroy communism. He set out to save it. His strategy was a two-pronged gamble, a desperate attempt to modernize the empire through two revolutionary concepts, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika, or restructuring, was the economic pillar of his gamble. Gorbachev recognized that the rigid, command-style economy was suffocating. He sought to introduce elements of market competition, to decentralize decision-making, and to allow for a degree of private enterprise. He wanted to inject the spirit of the market into the heart of the socialist state to jumpstart production and fix the chronic shortages that had become a way of life for Soviet citizens. But Gorbachev knew that economic reform was impossible without a fundamental shift in the political culture. You cannot fix a broken machine if the workers are too afraid to tell you where the gears are grinding. This led to his second pillar, glasnost, or openness. Glasnost was perhaps the most radical departure from Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy since the days of Lenin. It was an invitation to truth. Gorbachev encouraged freedom of speech, a more transparent press, and a reckoning with the dark chapters of Soviet history. He believed that by exposing the corruption of the bureaucracy and the failures of the past, he could harness the energy of the people to fuel his reforms. He wanted to move from a culture of fear to a culture of accountability. It was a gamble of unprecedented proportions. Gorbachev was essentially pulling the thread of a tapestry, hoping to reweave it into something stronger, but fearing the whole thing might unravel. He was right to fear. The gamble began to backfire almost immediately. Perestroika did not bring prosperity, it brought chaos. As the old command structures were dismantled, the new market mechanisms failed to take root. The supply chains broke, inflation spiked, and the shelves of Soviet stores, already often empty, became even more desolate. Instead of a revitalized economy, the people experienced a deeper sense of scarcity and instability. And then there was the effect of glasnost. Gorbachev had opened the floodgates, thinking he could control the flow of the water. But once the people were allowed to speak, they did not just criticize the corrupt bureaucrats. They began to question the very legitimacy of the Communist Party itself. The truth that glasnost unleashed was not a tool for reform, but a solvent that dissolved the ideological glue holding the Union together. The grievances that had been suppressed since the tanks rolled into Prague in 1968 came rushing to the surface, no longer as whispers, but as roars. Gorbachev had attempted to modernize the revolution, but in doing so, he had inadvertently invited the revolution to consume the state. August 1980, Gdansk, Poland. While Gorbachev was attempting to reform the Soviet center, the cracks in the Eastern Bloc had already become chasms in the periphery. If the Soviet Union was the heart of the communist empire, then Poland was its most volatile limb. For decades, the Polish United Workers' Party had maintained a fragile grip on the nation, balancing the heavy hand of Moscow with the deep, unshakable roots of the Polish Catholic Church. But by the late 1970s, the economic malaise that was suffocating the USSR had arrived in Poland with devastating force. Meat shortages, rising prices, and a crushing debt crisis had pushed the working class to the brink. The spark ignited at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. What began as a strike over rising food prices rapidly transformed into something the Kremlin had never seen before. A mass movement that was not just demanding better wages, but demanding dignity. At the center of this storm was Lech Walesa, an electrician with a charismatic presence and an uncompromising will. Under his leadership, the workers did not just walk off the job, they organized. They formed Solidarnosc, solidarity. It was a phenomenon that defied the very logic of Marxist-Leninist theory. For the first time in the history of the Eastern Bloc, the proletariat, the very class communism claimed to represent, was rising up against a proletarian state. Solidarity was not a mere labor union. It was a social revolution. It was a massive, grassroots coalition that bridged the gap between the shipyard workers, the intellectuals, and the Catholic Church. It demanded the right to organize independently of the party, the end of censorship, and a seat at the table of national governance. For a few shining months in the summer of 1980, it appeared that a democratic, non-communist alternative could exist within the socialist framework. But the Soviet Union could not tolerate a hole in its iron curtain. To Moscow, solidarity was a contagion. In December 1981, fearing a total loss of control, the Polish military leadership, with the implicit blessing of the Kremlin, declared martial law. Tanks rolled through the streets of Warsaw, thousands of activists were arrested, and solidarity was driven underground. Lech Walesa and his comrades were forced into a dangerous, clandestine existence. Yet the movement did not die. It merely went dormant, waiting for the winds of change. By the mid-1980s, the geopolitical landscape was shifting. Gorbachev's ascent in Moscow changed the calculus for the Polish leadership. The Brezhnev Doctrine, the policy that the Soviet Union would use military force to intervene in any satellite state where communism was threatened, was effectively dead. Gorbachev's glasnost meant that the Soviet Union no longer had the appetite, or perhaps the strength, to repeat the bloody interventions of the past. This shift provided the oxygen solidarity needed to breathe again. In 1989, faced with a collapsing economy and a nation in constant unrest, the Polish communist government was forced into something unthinkable: the Round Table Talks. These were negotiations between the ruling party and the banned Solidarity movement to discuss the future of the nation. The result was a seismic shift in the global order. In the elections of June 1989, Solidarity won a landslide victory, sweeping almost every contested seat. It was the first time in the history of the Eastern Bloc that a communist party had been democratically defeated by a labor movement. The dominoes had begun to fall. The resistance in the shipyards of Gdansk had proven that the ideological monopoly of the party was broken, setting the stage for the total collapse of the wall and the end of the Cold War itself. November 9, 1989, Berlin, Germany. If Poland had been the first domino to tilt, Berlin was the moment the entire structure collapsed. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall had stood as the ultimate physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain, a concrete scar cutting through the heart of Europe, separating the capitalist West from the communist East. It was more than a border. It was a psychological barrier that symbolized the division of humanity itself. But on this autumn night, the impossible happened. The collapse did not begin with a military invasion or a grand political treaty, but with a bureaucratic blunder. During a live, televised press conference, an East German official, Günter Schabowski, mistakenly announced that travel restrictions for East Germans would be lifted immediately, without delay. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, thousands of East Berliners descended upon the border crossings. The guards, confused and lacking orders from a paralyzed leadership, stood helpless as the sheer weight of human will pressed against the gates. When the first checkpoint at Bornholmer Strasse finally opened, the dam broke. People surged across, weeping, embracing strangers, and dancing atop the very wall that had once meant certain death to touch. The Cold War, which had defined the world for 4 decades, was being dismantled by the hands of ordinary citizens with hammers and chisels. But the fall of the wall was not an isolated miracle. It was the crescendo of a symphony of revolution that was sweeping across the entire Eastern Bloc. As the news of Berlin echoed through the streets of Prague, Budapest, and Bucharest, it became clear that the contagion of liberty was unstoppable. In Hungary, the revolution had been more subtle but equally profound. Earlier that year, the Hungarian government had begun dismantling the barbed wire fences along its border with Austria. This created the first physical hole in the Iron Curtain, allowing thousands of East Germans to flee to the west via Hungary, effectively bypassing the wall before it had even fallen. In Czechoslovakia, the movement took on a breathtaking momentum known as the Velvet Revolution. What began as peaceful student protests in Prague rapidly transformed into a massive nationwide uprising. Led by playwright and dissident Václav Havel, the people demanded an end to the one-party system. Through sheer, non-violent persistence, the communist regime was hollowed out from within, eventually stepping down to make way for a democratic government. Yet not every revolution was velvet. In Romania, the transition was baptized in fire. As the people of Bucharest rose up to demand the removal of Nicolae Ceausescu, the state responded with brutal, lethal force. The dictator's grip on power was absolute, and his security forces were prepared to kill to maintain it. But the momentum of 1989 was a force of nature that even the most paranoid autocrats could not suppress. In a rapid, violent sequence of events, Ceausescu was overthrown and executed, marking the bloodiest end to a communist regime in the region. By the time the calendar turned to 1990, the map of Europe had been fundamentally rewritten. The monolithic bloc of communist satellite states had vanished almost overnight. The ideological certainty that had governed the post-war world was gone, replaced by a chaotic, exhilarating, and uncertain era of democratization. The revolution of '89 had proven that the Iron Curtain was not a permanent fixture of history, but a temporary barrier that had finally been breached. December 25, 1991, Moscow, Russia. The world watched in stunned silence as the red flag, which had flown over the Kremlin since the dawn of the Soviet era, was slowly lowered for the last time. As the banner descended, replaced by the white, blue, and red tricolor of the Russian Federation, an era didn't just end, it evaporated. The Soviet Union, a superpower that had once commanded half the globe and challenged the very foundations of capitalism, was officially dead. To understand how a titan could fall so abruptly, we must look past the falling walls of Berlin and into the decaying heart of the Soviet state itself. For decades, the USSR had been held together by a delicate, increasingly brittle architecture of central planning, ideological fervor, and the looming shadow of the KGB. But by the late 1980s, that architecture was crumbling under its own weight. The economy was no longer just stagnant. It was in a state of terminal decay. Shortages of basic goods, bread, soap, fuel, became the daily reality for millions, turning the promises of a proletarian utopia into a bitter irony. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man tasked with saving the system, had attempted a radical gamble. Through glasnost or openness, he sought to invite transparency and truth into the political process. Through perestroika or restructuring, he hoped to modernize the economy. But Gorbachev had unwittingly unleashed a Pandora's box. By allowing the people to speak, he gave them the vocabulary to criticize. By loosening the grip of the state, he allowed the long-suppressed forces of nationalism to surge. The Soviet Union was not a monolith. It was a sprawling mosaic of dozens of distinct ethnicities and republics. Once the fear of the central authority was diminished, the cracks widened. From the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to the Caucasus and Ukraine, the cry for independence became a deafening roar. The Brezhnev Doctrine, the policy that the Soviet Union would intervene militarily to keep any socialist state in line, was effectively dead. The Kremlin could no longer afford to be the world's policeman, and the empire was bleeding out. The final, fatal blow came from within the halls of power. In August 1991, a group of hardline communist officials attempted a coup to topple Gorbachev and restore order. They failed. The coup was a spectacular display of impotence, proving that the old guard no longer held the loyalty of the people or the military. In the vacuum left by the failed coup, Boris Yeltsin emerged as the new titan of Russian politics, a man who realized that the only way to secure a democratic future for Russia was to dismantle the Soviet Union entirely. By December, the central government in Moscow had become a ghost. The constituent republics, seeing the writing on the wall, declared their own sovereignty. The Soviet Union had become a legal fiction, an empty shell. When the dissolution was finalized, it sent a shockwave through the geopolitical landscape that would be felt for generations. The bipolar world of the Cold War was over. The struggle between two competing visions of human civilization had reached a conclusion that few had predicted. The Red Star had fallen, leaving behind a fractured landscape of new nations, a broken economy, and a world that had to learn, quite suddenly, how to live without its greatest rival. 1991, Beijing, China. As the Soviet Union dissolved into a memory, the leaders in Beijing watched the chaos in Moscow with a profound, chilling sense of caution. To the Chinese Communist Party, the collapse of the USSR was not merely a geopolitical shift. It was a cautionary tale of what happens when a communist state loses its grip on both political authority and economic control. While the Soviet experiment had perished under the weight of failed liberalization, China was preparing to embark on a path that would defy every traditional definition of Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. If the Soviet Union's failure was a lesson in the dangers of perestroika, China's survival would be defined by its antithesis. The stage was set by Deng Xiaoping, a pragmatist who understood that for the party to maintain its monopoly on power, it first had to deliver prosperity to a population weary of ideological purity and crushing poverty. Deng famously remarked that it did not matter if a cat was black or white, as long as it caught mice. In the language of political economy, this meant that the color of the ideology mattered less than the results of the policy. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1990s, China initiated the reform and opening up policy. This was not a move toward Western-style democracy, but rather a calculated, surgical integration of market mechanisms into a command economy. This became known as socialism with Chinese characteristics, though critics and economists more frequently refer to it as state capitalism. The transformation was radical. The state began by decollectivizing agriculture, allowing peasants to sell surplus crops on the open market. Then, it moved to the cities, creating special economic zones, islands of capitalism like Shenzhen, where foreign investment, technology, and capitalist management could flourish under the watchful eye of the state. The goal was to harness the engine of global trade to build a massive industrial base, all while ensuring the Communist Party remained the ultimate architect of the nation's direction. This was a fundamental departure from the Maoist era. Gone were the chaotic whims of the Great Leap Forward. In their place came a disciplined, state-directed pursuit of GDP growth. The government maintained control over the commanding heights of the economy, the banks, the energy sectors, and the heavy industries, while allowing a hyper-competitive private sector to erupt in the margins. The results were nothing short of a miracle or a paradox, depending on your perspective. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of absolute poverty in a single generation. China transformed from a fractured, agrarian society into the world's factory, a central pillar of the global supply chain and the second largest economy on Earth. Yet this Chinese model created a new set of tensions. It birthed a class of billionaires and a staggering wealth gap, realities that Marx would have viewed as the ultimate betrayal of the proletariat. It also created a unique hybrid, a high-tech, market-driven powerhouse governed by a Leninist political structure that remains more centralized and surveillance-capable than any of its predecessors. As the 21st century progressed, the world realized that the fall of the Soviet Union had not signaled the end of history or the death of communism. Instead, it had merely forced the ideology to evolve, creating a new, formidable challenger that operates by the rules of the market but follows the dictates of the party. 1986, Hanoi, Vietnam. While China was already deep into its radical economic pivot, the Communist Party of Vietnam was facing a parallel, existential crisis. For decades, Vietnam had been defined by the struggle for national liberation and the brutal, unifying fires of the Vietnam War. But in the aftermath of reunification in 1975, the dream of a unified socialist utopia collided with a devastating reality. The state had attempted to impose a rigid, Soviet-style command economy across the entire country, forcing collectivization on the South and prioritizing heavy industry at the expense of basic necessities. The result was a catastrophe. By the mid-1980s, the Vietnamese economy was in a state of near-total collapse. Hyperinflation was rampant, food shortages were chronic, and the nation was crippled by a crippling international isolation. The country was not only struggling to feed its people, but was also buckling under the weight of a massive debt to the Soviet bloc, which was itself beginning to fracture. The ideological purity of the era had produced nothing but stagnation and hardship. The leadership in Hanoi realized that if the party did not change, the people might force the change themselves. In 1986, at the 6th National Congress of the Communist Party, a landmark decision was made. They would not follow the path of total liberalization seen in the collapsing Eastern Bloc. Instead, they would implement a policy of D-stroke letter 1ED5 IM letter 1EDB I renovation. Much like the pragmatic shift occurring in Beijing, D-stroke letter 1ED5 IM letter 1EDB I was a calculated survival mechanism. It was a move to transition from a centrally planned economy to a socialist-oriented market economy. The core of this reform was the recognition of the market as a tool rather than an enemy. The state began the slow, often painful process of dismantling collective farms, returning land use rights to individual peasant households. For the first time in decades, farmers had an incentive to produce more than just what was required by the state. They could produce for profit. As agriculture stabilized, the reforms moved into the industrial and urban sectors. Vietnam began to peel back the layers of isolation, seeking to integrate itself into the global community. This meant opening the doors to foreign direct investment, embracing international trade, and eventually normalizing relations with the very Western powers it had once fought against. The transformation was profound. Vietnam pivoted from a country on the brink of famine to one of the fastest-growing economies in Southeast Asia. It became a global hub for manufacturing, textiles, and electronics, weaving itself into the fabric of the global supply chain. The Doi Moi era saw the rise of a burgeoning middle class and a dramatic reduction in poverty levels that once seemed insurmountable. However, this integration came with a profound ideological paradox. To save the Communist Party, the state had to embrace the very mechanisms of capitalism it had once sought to destroy. Today, Vietnam stands as a striking example of the survivalist model of communism. It is a nation where the red flag of the party still flies high, yet its economy is fueled by the relentless, borderless engine of global capitalism. It proves that in the post-Cold War era, the survival of a communist regime may no longer depend on its ability to command the economy, but on its ability to master it. 1994, Pyongyang, North Korea. While Vietnam was opening its doors to the global market to ensure the survival of its ruling party, a different, much darker reality was unfolding just a few hundred miles to the north. If Vietnam represents the survivalist model of communist adaptation, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, stands as its absolute, uncompromising antithesis. As the Soviet Union collapsed and its subsidies to its satellite states vanished, the North Korean economy did not pivot. It did not reform. Instead, it retreated into a state of profound, agonizing isolation. The country, which had once seen significant industrial growth under Soviet tutelage, was suddenly severed from the lifeblood of its existence. The result was the arduous march, a period of devastating famine in the mid-1990s that claimed hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of lives. But unlike China or Vietnam, where the leadership recognized that economic liberalization was the only path to political longevity, the Kim dynasty chose a different route. the solidification of Juche. Juche, or self-reliance, is the foundational ideology of the North Korean state. While it shares a linguistic root with Marxism, it has evolved into something far more distinct, and some argue, something closer to a secular religion. It posits that the Korean people must be the masters of their own destiny, independent of foreign influence and economic reliance. In practice, Juche became the ideological justification for the country's total withdrawal from the world. It transformed the state from a traditional communist entity into a hereditary, absolute autocracy, a hermit kingdom where the line between the state, the party, and the Kim bloodline has effectively vanished. In North Korea, the class struggle has been replaced by an unwavering cult of personality. The social fabric is governed by the Songbun system, a rigid, hereditary caste structure that determines a citizen's loyalty, privileges, and access to resources based on their perceived devotion to the regime. Here, the communist dream of a classless society has been inverted into a hyper-stratified hierarchy where political loyalty is the only true currency. As the rest of the communist world moved toward varying degrees of market integration, North Korea doubled down on its isolation. To compensate for its economic impotence and to ensure the survival of the regime against a hostile, capitalist-dominated world, the state turned toward a different kind of power: nuclear proliferation. The pursuit of nuclear weapons became the ultimate expression of Juche, the ability to defend the revolution through sheer, terrifying technological self-reliance, regardless of the cost to the civilian population. Today, North Korea remains a chilling anomaly in the 21st century. It is a nation frozen in time, a living museum of a radical, distorted version of the 20th century revolutionary spirit. It exists in a state of permanent tension, perpetually on the brink of collapse, yet remarkably resilient in its ability to exert influence through fear and nuclear brinkmanship. In the grand tapestry of communist history, if Vietnam is the story of the ideology's pragmatic evolution, North Korea is the story of its most extreme, isolated, and defiant survival. It is the ultimate proof that while most communist states found a way to live with the market, one state found a way to survive by rejecting the world entirely. 2024, London, United Kingdom. If North Korea represents the frozen, radicalized extreme of the communist legacy, it does not follow that the ideology has vanished from the rest of the world. To suggest that the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the end of history, or the final victory of liberal capitalism, would be a profound misunderstanding of the modern political landscape. While the era of massive, state-led industrial revolutions and the bipolar struggle between superpowers has passed, the underlying currents of communist thought and its modern descendants continue to ripple through the veins of global politics. We must distinguish between the state and the ideology. While the traditional Marxist-Leninist state models have largely been modified or dismantled, the core grievances that fueled the original revolutions, inequality, the perceived exploitation of the working class, and the concentration of power in the hands of a global elite, remain as potent as they were in the 19th century. In the West, we see a resurgence of neo-Marxist critiques. These are not movements seeking to seize the means of production through armed insurrection, but rather intellectual and political frameworks that apply the lens of class struggle to modern issues. Today, the debate is no longer just about the factory floor. It has migrated to the digital economy, the gig economy, and the widening chasm between the precariat, a new class of insecure, underpaid workers, and the billionaire class. The language of oppressor and oppressed has been recalibrated, finding new life in social justice movements and critiques of global neoliberalism. In the global South, the ghost of communism still haunts the halls of power through the lens of anti-imperialism. For many nations in Latin America and parts of Africa, the communist identity is less about the rigid dictates of a central planning committee and more about a fierce resistance to foreign economic hegemony. Movements that rose to power in the late 20th century often utilized the rhetoric of the Red Revolution to champion national sovereignty and the redistribution of land and resources. Here, communism is a tool of defiance, a way to frame the struggle against the perceived dictates of Washington or the International Monetary Fund. Furthermore, we see the rise of digital authoritarianism, a phenomenon where the centralized control once sought by Stalin or Mao is being reimagined through the lens of big data and surveillance technology. While not strictly communist in the classical sense, the impulse toward total state management of the social fabric, the desire to harmonize the individual with the collective interest through technological oversight, echoes the most ambitious and most terrifying dreams of the early 20th century revolutionaries. So does communism live. It lives not as a monolithic block of nations, but as a persistent, shifting set of questions. It lives in every critique of unchecked capitalism, in every movement demanding a radical restructuring of wealth, and in every state that seeks to prioritize the collective over the individual. The red flags of the past may have been lowered, but the red ink of the ideology continues to be written into the margins of modern political discourse. The struggle is no longer a war of borders, but a war of ideas, a struggle to define the relationship between the person, the state, and the machine of global commerce. 2024, London, United Kingdom. To conclude our journey through the 20th century and into the present, we must step back from the shifting political tides and attempt a final, sober assessment. How do we weigh a century defined by the most ambitious social experiment in human history? When we look at the wreckage and the monuments left behind by the communist era, we are forced to confront a paradox. A movement that promised total liberation often delivered total subjugation. If we look for successes, we must look through a lens of rapid, often forced, modernization. For many agrarian societies, the arrival of a communist regime acted as a violent catalyst for industrialization. In the Soviet Union and China, millions were lifted from subsistence farming into an industrial age in a matter of decades, a feat that took Western nations much longer to achieve. We see in the historical record the rapid expansion of literacy, the advancement of scientific research, and the establishment of robust social safety nets that provided basic health care and education to populations previously ignored by the old imperial orders. For a certain segment of the global proletariat, the promise of dignity through labor and the eradication of feudal hierarchies felt, for a time, like a tangible reality. But these successes were bought at a price that defies easy calculation. The failures of communism were not merely economic, they were systemic and structural. The central planning models that sought to replace the chaos of the market with the rationality of the state ultimately succumbed to the weight of their own inefficiency. Without the signals of price and demand, resources were misallocated, innovation stagnated, and the inevitable shortages of consumer goods bred a pervasive sense of malaise. The dream of a classless society instead birthed a new, untouchable class, the party bureaucracy, or the nomenclatura, which enjoyed privileges that the very workers they claimed to represent could only dream of. Yet, the most harrowing chapter of this assessment is the human cost. We cannot speak of the history of communism without speaking of the millions of lives extinguished by the machinery of the state. The Great Purges, the forced collectivization of the peasantry, the Great Leap Forward, and the horrors of the Khmer Rouge stand as grim testaments to what happens when ideology is placed above the sanctity of human life. When the state becomes the sole arbiter of truth, morality, and survival, dissent is no longer a political difference. It becomes a death sentence. The gulags, the famine-stricken provinces, and the mass executions were not accidents of the system. They were often the logical, if extreme, conclusions of a philosophy that viewed individuals as mere cells in a larger social organism. As we close this documentary, we are left with a complicated legacy. Communism provided a profound critique of the inequalities inherent in capitalism, forcing the world to reckon with the rights of the worker and the distribution of wealth. It challenged the hegemony of empires and gave voice to the colonized. But it also demonstrated the terrifying capacity of centralized power to crush the human spirit. The history of communism is a cautionary tale about the dangers of utopianism, a reminder that when we attempt to build a paradise on earth through the absolute control of the state, we often find ourselves building a prison instead. 2024, London, United Kingdom. As we stand amidst the wreckage of the 20th century's grandest ideological war, a haunting question remains, echoing through the halls of academia and the streets of the global metropole. Is the story of class struggle truly over? For decades, the collapse of the Soviet Union was heralded as the end of history, the final victory of liberal capitalism, and the definitive closing of the book on radical alternatives. But as the 21st century matures, the cracks in the capitalist edifice are becoming impossible to ignore. We find ourselves in an era of profound instability. The promise of perpetual growth is colliding with the finite realities of a warming planet. The widening chasm of wealth inequality, which Marx once predicted would become the defining feature of the industrial age, has not been solved by the market. In many ways, it has been accelerated by it. As automation and artificial intelligence threaten to decouple labor from survival, the old structures of employment and social security are beginning to fray. The specter of the useless class is no longer a science fiction trope, but a looming socioeconomic anxiety. In this vacuum of certainty, the search for a post-capitalist alternative has moved from the revolutionary barricades to the fringes of digital networks and the centers of progressive thought. We are seeing a resurgence of interest in ideas that were once dismissed as relics of a failed past. Some look toward degrowth, the radical notion that humanity must abandon the pursuit of infinite economic expansion to ensure ecological survival. Others explore universal basic income, a mechanism that seeks to decouple human dignity from market productivity, effectively providing a floor upon which a new kind of social contract might be built. There is even a burgeoning interest in digital socialism, where the vast data and computational power currently owned by a handful of tech giants could, in theory, be repurposed into a decentralized, democratic way of managing resources, a high-tech evolution of the central planning that failed so catastrophically in the previous century. Yet, we must approach these new visions with a profound sense of historical humility. The 20th century taught us that the desire to reorder society from the top down, fueled by the intoxicating certainty of a perfect blueprint, often leads to catastrophe. The mistake of the old guard was the belief that the state could and should act as the sole architect of human existence. The challenge for the next generation will be to answer the fundamental critique that Marx and his successors leveled at the world. How can we organize a society that provides for the needs of all without sacrificing the liberties of the individual? Can we achieve a more equitable distribution of wealth without the crushing weight of a totalitarian bureaucracy? Can we build a system that is both sustainable for the planet and respectful of the human spirit? The history of communism is a testament to the power of an idea to move mountains, and to the terror of that same idea when it loses its humanity. As we look toward the horizon, we are not looking for a new utopia to impose upon the world, but for a way to navigate the chaos of the present. The search for a post-capitalist future is not just a political debate. It is a struggle to define what it means to live a meaningful life in a world that is changing faster than our ability to govern it.